But imagine now we're going to go across the ocean to the island of Japan. Do any of you guys read comics from Japan?
No.
No, none of you? Really? They're called manga, and the people of Japan love comics. And one of the reasons is they're used to traveling long distances on public transit. So people would have to travel a long ways, so they'd bring comics with them and read. And it's not just kids who like comics in Japan. Grown-ups, grandpas, everybody loves comics. One of the reasons was people would perform comics in the street, and it was called Kamishibai, and that means paper drama. And usually a male, he'd be called Uncle Kamishibai or Oji-san, and he would come and he'd ride his bike into town and he'd snap 2 sticks together. Clack, 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 clack. And then all the kids would come out of the houses to go watch his show. And it was said that the cracking sticks would draw out kids like ice cream bells, bring kids out from their houses in America. And he would sell candy to the kids in the front row, and he would perform the story. And first he'd perform a silly story with lots of sound effects to draw a crowd. And then he'd perform a story for girls that would be about, maybe about a pet, like this story about a girl who finds an abandoned kitten and wants to adopt it, but her mean dad won't let her. And then he'd perform a story for boys, an action story, maybe with a hero kind of like Peter Pan. Maybe he can fly. This one's called Prince Gamma versus the Sea Monster. And then when those kids grew up, they would receive news and propaganda through the same formula, through Kamishibai. And it was said that when television came out, people didn't know what to call it. They called it electronic Kamishibai. Who's that?
Batman.
Batman. Sometimes bootlegs, I call it, of Western culture would show up in Japan. They'd make a comic of Batman or of a Western like Cowboys and Indians, or of a baseball story. And I think it's interesting that I'm an American, and I drew a version of a Japanese version of American hero Batman. It's like whoop, whoop, whoop. Oh, and Prince Gamma, like the story that was full of action, it would end with a cliffhanger that would say, if you want to know what happens next, come back next week when I perform again. Sometimes these Kamishibai would have political messages. This picture was from a Kamishibai called Land of the Workers, and it showed landlords as being greedy. So it was outlawed by the government because they didn't want the ideas of this cartoon expressed to the people. And sometimes war news would be told through Kamishibai. They'd say, our heroes fought in the war, and some of them died, and some of them succeeded. When America went to war with Japan, and America lost, then the commander-in-chief of Japan, General MacArthur, was given complete control over Japan, and he outlawed all stories of ninja, and he outlawed all stories of samurai, and he outlawed all karate and other martial arts. He said these are too warlike, and he replaced them with baseball and westerns. Kung Fu. This was one of my favorite stories doing the research, was the Sanryu Kabuki, called second-rate Kabuki. And this was when actors who were no longer allowed to work because of the new laws, they would run into town and they'd look around, are there any police? No? Okay. And they'd get their props and their costumes out of a bag and they'd put on a little show in the street for people. And then they'd put all their costumes back in the bag and hide and pretend to be ordinary people again and then walk away.
Ninjas.
Yeah, it's kind of like ninjas.